A 79-year-old woman is humiliated for wearing simple clothes on a flight, but then the captain recognizes her. Margaret Lewis, a 79-year-old woman with silver hair and a gentle demeanor, was no stranger to flying. She had taken many trips throughout her life, but today was different. As she entered the bustling airport terminal, she noticed the glances of the younger passengers, who seemed to be in a rush, wearing their most fashionable clothes, rushing to their flights. Margaret, however, wasn't bothered by the stares. She was dressed simply, a soft knitted sweater and a modest skirt, the type of clothes that had served her well over the years. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just an ordinary woman with a love for adventure. Once on the plane, she found her seat and settled in, tucking her purse under her seat and adjusting her shawl. She didn't need luxury, just comfort. Yet, something felt off today. It was as if the attention she was receiving wasn't just from the way she looked, but because of something else entirely. The whispers around her seat weren't kind. As she adjusted the seatbelt, a young flight attendant named Claire walked by, taking in Margaret's appearance with a glance of judgment. She didn't see an elderly woman traveling for leisure or an adventure. She saw someone she thought didn't belong on this flight. Claire did her job, serving drinks and greeting passengers with a smile. But when she passed by Margaret's seat, she couldn't help but comment to a fellow crew member just loud enough for others to hear, "I don't understand how some people think they belong in a place like this." The words stung Margaret, but she chose to ignore them, focusing instead on the flight ahead. She had endured her fair share of judgment in life, people judging her for her age, for her simple lifestyle. It didn't bother her much, not anymore. But it was the next comment that would change everything. As Claire passed by again, this time offering the beverage cart, she paused and muttered, "I guess it's nice when people can afford a little luxury now and then." Margaret's heart sank. She was no stranger to discrimination, but this wasn't something she had expected. Still, she smiled softly and tried to ignore the slight. She was stronger than this. She'd always been. Then, as the flight went on, Claire continued her rounds, her comments never ceasing. Each time Margaret tried to settle into her seat, there was a passing look, a comment under the breath. And that's when it happened. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, causing a few passengers to grip their armrests. Margaret, though slightly unsettled, remained calm, her hands resting on her lap. But just as the plane steadied, the intercom came to life. "Good afternoon, passengers," a voice spoke. "This is your captain speaking. We have a slight delay, but we should be on our way shortly. Thanks for your patience." But what happened next was completely unexpected. The captain's voice didn't just announce the delay, it was followed by a brief pause. Then, with authority and a hint of familiarity, he said, "I'd like to extend a warm welcome to one of our most honored passengers today, Margaret Lewis. It's an honor to have you aboard." Suddenly, all eyes turned toward Margaret. Her heart skipped a beat. How did the captain know her name? And why had he called her out in front of everyone? The murmurs of surprise grew louder. The young flight attendants, including Claire, looked visibly shocked. What was happening? Who was Margaret Lewis? And why was the captain singling her out? As Margaret sat frozen, unsure of what was happening, the captain's voice came through again, this time softer. "Let's just say, Margaret Lewis isn't an ordinary passenger on this flight. She's someone whose legacy has helped shape this very airline." The murmurs of surprise continued to ripple through the cabin as Margaret sat in stunned silence, unsure of what was happening. The captain's words echoed in her mind, each syllable heavy with meaning. "Margaret Lewis isn't an ordinary passenger." She glanced around at the curious faces now turned toward her. The once dismissive flight attendant, Claire, looked as though she had just seen a ghost. As the passengers tried to process what they had just heard, the captain's voice came through the intercom again, this time with a touch of warmth. "I know you're all wondering why I called out Ms. Lewis. Well, let me explain." There was a slight pause before he continued, his voice filled with admiration. "Margaret Lewis isn't just another elderly woman traveling for leisure. She's one of the original founding members of this airline, someone whose dedication helped shape this airline into what it is today." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Her hand instinctively reached for her seatbelt as the weight of the captain's words sank in. How could they know about her? She hadn't worked for the airline in decades. She was just a regular passenger now, enjoying her flight, not expecting to be treated like this. The passengers around her seemed even more taken aback, some whispering to one another, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Claire, still standing near the aisle, seemed utterly mortified. She had just spent the last hour dismissing Margaret, assuming she was just another elderly woman with no importance. Now, she realized that Margaret was someone far more significant than she could have imagined. The captain continued, Margaret was instrumental in helping to establish the early flights for this airline, back when it was just a small regional carrier. She was the one who fought tirelessly for better services, better conditions for passengers, and safer flights for all. Margaret could feel the weight of the room's attention. She hadn't expected to be recognized this way, and certainly not in front of an entire plane. Her mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a simple flight anymore. It was about something much bigger, something she hadn't thought about in years. As the captain spoke of her contributions, a flood of memories rushed back to Margaret. The early days of the airline, when she and her colleagues worked around the clock to make sure things ran smoothly, when every flight felt like a small victory. She had been so focused on the journey that she had almost forgotten the impact her work had on the airline's success. The captain wrapped up his announcement with a final note of gratitude. So, if you see Margaret on this flight, remember that she's not just any passenger. She's a true pioneer, and we owe a great deal of our success to her efforts. Please join me in thanking her for all she's done. The cabin fell silent for a moment before the applause started. At first it was hesitant, unsure, but then, slowly, passengers began to clap, some even standing in ovation. Margaret's face flushed a deep red as the overwhelming wave of appreciation washed over her. But as the applause settled, the moment shifted. The flight attendant Claire, who had been so dismissive just moments ago, was now standing before Margaret, her eyes full of regret. I had no idea, Claire stammered. I'm so sorry, Ms. Lewis. I didn't know who you were. Margaret looked up at her, her face softening. She had seen the younger woman's genuine remorse. With a calm, reassuring smile, Margaret reached out, gently patting Claire's hand. It's all right, dear. Sometimes we forget the past, but I'm glad we can all learn from it. As the plane continued its journey through the clouds, the initial shock of the captain's announcement began to fade, but the energy in the cabin remained different. The passengers, once absorbed in their own little worlds, were now fully aware of the incredible woman sitting just a few rows away from them. Conversations shifted from typical in-flight chatter to admiring comments about Margaret. Many of them began to approach her, some asking about her experiences with the airline, while others simply expressed their gratitude for the contributions she had made. Margaret, though overwhelmed by the attention, couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had been part of something bigger than herself, and now it felt like the weight of that legacy was finally being recognized. It wasn't about the accolades or the applause. It was the acknowledgement that her efforts had made a real difference in shaping the future of the airline industry. The flight continued, but for Margaret the air felt different. She had spent her life quietly contributing, not seeking the spotlight, and now her humble contributions were being acknowledged in a way she had never expected. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Claire, the flight attendant, returned to Margaret's seat a few minutes later, this time with a different demeanor. She was no longer the judgmental young woman who had dismissed Margaret earlier. Her posture was more respectful, and her tone was softer. Ms. Lewis, she began, I just wanted to say that I'm deeply sorry for how I treated you. I should never have assumed anything about you, and I am truly grateful for all you've done for this airline. I've learned a lot today. Margaret looked up at Claire, her face warm with understanding. She knew what it was like to make mistakes, especially when faced with something unfamiliar. It's all right, dear, she replied kindly. We all have a lot to learn. I just hope that my story can inspire you to see the bigger picture. Claire smiled, genuinely this time. You've certainly inspired me. The rest of the flight continued in a calm, reflective atmosphere. Margaret shared stories of the airline's early days, of the challenges they had faced, and the sacrifices they had made to ensure its success. Passengers listened intently, captivated by her words. The stories were rich with history, and every person in the cabin could feel the weight of those moments. But it wasn't just the passengers and the flight attendants who had learned something today. Even the CEO, who had been watching from the back of the plane, took note of the ripple effect Margaret's presence had created. As the plane began its descent, he stood up and made his way down the aisle to Margaret's seat. He had been quiet during the flight, but now he saw the need to acknowledge Margaret himself. Martha, it's an honor to meet you, he said, shaking her hand firmly. I've heard a lot about you, and I wanted to personally thank you for all your work. Your legacy has inspired not just our team, but an entire industry. This airline wouldn't be what it is today without you." Margaret smiled softly, feeling both humbled and honored. The recognition she had long gone without was now flooding her, and it was a sweet, bittersweet feeling. As the plane touched down and the seatbelt sign was switched off, the passengers slowly began to gather their belongings, but the atmosphere had completely changed. The murmurs of admiration for Margaret still lingered in the air, and many passengers took a moment to thank her for sharing her stories. It was clear that Margaret's legacy had left an indelible mark on this flight, one that would be remembered for years to come. Margaret, still processing everything, felt a deep sense of pride, but also a deep humility. Her work had been a quiet effort, never seeking recognition, yet here she was, the subject of admiration and respect from people she had never met. As she stood to collect her things, the CEO of the airline, still seated a few rows behind, walked forward. He wasn't just walking down the aisle to leave. He was coming to her with a purpose. "Ms. Lewis," he said as he approached her with a warm, respectful smile, "I'd like to personally thank you for all you've done. Your contributions have helped shape this airline, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that we wouldn't be here without your hard work and dedication." Margaret smiled, grateful but modest. "I just did what I thought was right at the time. It wasn't about recognition. It was about making sure the future of the airline was secure." The CEO nodded, clearly impressed by her humility. "Well, your actions have shaped not only the airline, but also the aviation industry as a whole. I'm sure you know that your work still impacts our operations every single day." Margaret, taken aback by his words, simply nodded, humbled by the recognition. But then, the CEO took a breath, his tone becoming even more serious. "I wanted to ask you if you'd consider working with us again. I know you've retired, but your wisdom and experience are invaluable. We're looking to launch a new initiative that honors our legacy, and I can think of no one better to help us lead that effort." For a moment, Margaret was speechless. She had long retired, content with her peaceful life, but the offer from the CEO felt like the final acknowledgement of a lifetime's work. "I'm honored by your offer, but I've been retired for quite some time now. I don't know if I have it in me." The CEO smiled gently. "No pressure, of course, but if you ever change your mind, the door is always open. I believe the next generation of leaders would benefit greatly from your insight." Margaret thought for a moment. She had worked hard all her life, and although she was in the twilight of her years, the idea of giving back to the industry that had shaped so much of her life seemed like a worthy cause. After all, her career had always been about legacy, ensuring that others would build on the foundation she had helped lay. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'll think about it." The CEO nodded, shaking her hand once more. "Whatever you decide, Ms. Lewis, know that you've already given more than anyone could ever ask for. Thank you for everything." As the passengers began to leave the plane, Margaret felt a quiet pride swell in her chest. This wasn't just about her legacy being recognized. It was about the reminder that sometimes, no matter how much time has passed, the work we do has lasting impact. She had spent her life building something greater than herself, and even now, it was still evolving. Weeks passed since the flight, but the story of Margaret Lewis and her unexpected recognition spread far beyond the cabin. The media picked up on the heartwarming tale of the elderly woman who had shaped an entire industry, and soon, Margaret's legacy became a symbol of dedication, wisdom, and perseverance. Everywhere she went, people stopped her to share their gratitude, not just for her work with the airline, but for her grace and humility in the face of unexpected attention. At the airline's headquarters, things were changing. The CEO, William Harris, followed through on his promise to honor Margaret's contributions. He launched a new legacy leadership initiative, which sought to bring in veterans from the airline's early years to help mentor the next generation of workers. Margaret was invited to speak at the launch event, and though she hesitated, at first she realized this was an opportunity to inspire others. Her life's work had always been about lifting others up, and now she had a chance to ensure her values lived on. At the event, Margaret took to the stage, her heart racing as the applause echoed in the auditorium. It had been years since she had spoken to such a large crowd, but something inside her told her that this was the moment she had been waiting for. She began by sharing her story, not just of hard work and dedication, but of the lessons she had learned over the years, lessons of kindness, respect, and the importance of leaving a legacy for others to build upon. The audience, made up of young, employees and industry veterans alike, hung on to every word. Margaret didn't speak of her own achievements, but instead, she spoke of the power of collective effort and shared vision. Her words resonated deeply with the new generation of workers who were just starting their careers, and many of them approached her afterward, eager to learn more. Margaret's message had transcended the past. She had not only left a mark on the airline industry, but had now become a beacon of inspiration for those still working to create their own legacies. Her work was far from over. Margaret realized that even in her later years, her experiences and the wisdom she had accumulated could still make a difference. She had seen how the airline had grown, but more importantly, she had seen the potential in the people who were now running it. The company had become a leader in its field, but it was Margaret's core belief in empowering others that would ensure its continued success. The CEO, William Harris, made sure that her impact was commemorated in a permanent way. He suggested naming one of the new training programs after Margaret Lewis, a symbol of her contribution and the leadership she had shown throughout her life. Margaret was deeply touched by this gesture. As the years went on, Margaret continued to mentor young employees, offering her guidance whenever she could. She became a beloved figure in the company, not because of her title or position, but because of her ability to make people believe in themselves. She had been the unsung hero of the airline industry, but now her name was synonymous with integrity, leadership, and vision.